The house had stood for so long that it seemed less like a structure and more like a creature, something that had grown out of the land itself, fed by years of sweat, sorrow, and whispers. The Wainwright estate was not grand by modern standards, but in the late 1800s, it commanded respect. Its whitewashed columns were stained by time and smoke, its windows clouded by dust and age. Vines crept up its walls, curling around the veranda as though trying to drag it back into the soil it had risen from. Every plank and nail carried the memory of those who had built it, worked it, and suffered within it. And among those memories, one name echoed quietly through the years: Dinah. Dinah had been born on that land, in a wooden shack near the sugarcane fields that shimmered under the Alabama sun. Her mother had worked in the same kitchen where Dinah would one day spend nearly all her life. When freedom came, it did not arrive with fanfare or hope. The papers changed, but the lives didn't. People like Dinah were told they were free, but free to what? To stay, to serve, to survive on scraps of dignity offered by men who still thought of them as property. So, Dinah stayed. Not out of love, not even out of loyalty. She stayed because there was nowhere else to go. The Wainwrights had owned the land since before the war. They were once known for their hospitality, their Sunday feasts, their sprawling fields of tobacco and corn. But by the time Dinah reached womanhood, the estate was fading. The war had bled it dry. Only one Wainwright remained to keep the house standing: Thomas Wainwright, a man whose silence filled every room he entered. His face was the kind that never softened. His eyes, a cold gray, measured people the way a butcher sizes meat. He did not raise his voice often, because he didn't have to. A look from him was command enough. When Dinah was 15, she became the head cook of the estate. That kitchen was her world. It smelled of lard, ash, onions, and the faint sweetness of molasses that never quite left the air. Every morning before sunrise, she lit the fire, boiled water, and scrubbed the cast-iron pots until her fingers cracked. Her hands bore 1,000 tiny scars, each one earned quietly, each one healed without complaint. Over time, she learned the rhythm of the house better than anyone. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the sound of the master's boots across the floorboards, even the sigh of the wind through the shutters. All of it spoke to her like a second language. People said Dinah had a gift. She could take the barest ingredients and turn them into a feast. On Christmas mornings, the aroma of her biscuits and gravy drifted all the way to the fields. When sickness passed through the nearby town, she brewed teas and tonics that eased pain and fever. The other servants whispered that she had the old knowledge, her mother's kind of knowing. They said she could read a person's fate from the way the steam rose off a pot. Dinah never said whether it was true. She simply stirred her food and listened to the fire breathe. Her relationship with Thomas Wainwright was peculiar, neither warm nor cruel, just unspoken. He trusted her in ways that unsettled the others. She was allowed into rooms no one else entered. She handled the household money when necessary, delivered messages in town, and even sat at the edge of the dining room while he ate, ready to serve at a moment's notice. To an outsider, she might have looked like a fixture in his life, an old habit he couldn't break. But beneath the surface of their quiet routine lay something deeper, an invisible chain of memory and guilt. Because Dinah had seen what happened to his first wife. It was the summer of 1859. The fields were alive with the drone of cicadas, the air thick as honey. The mistress, Anne Wainwright, was a gentle soul who often brought Dinah small gifts: a ribbon, a bit of soap, a book with no pictures. But she also carried bruises she never spoke of, and eyes that often wandered toward the door when her husband entered the room. Dinah remembered one night, the sound of a quarrel, a scream, then silence. The next morning, Anne was gone. They said she had taken sick and been sent away to recover. But Dinah knew she hadn't. She had seen Thomas by the river, shovel in hand, his clothes wet to the knees. And though she never spoke of it, she felt the weight of that secret every time she saw his face in the years that followed. After the war, the plantation changed. The slaves were gone, but the poverty remained. Dinah stayed because the outside world frightened her more than the ghosts inside those walls. She saw men who had been freed die in ditches with no work, no shelter, no name. The Wainwright estate, for all its shadows, was at least familiar. And so she remained, bound not by law but by time, until the house and she seemed to share the same heartbeat. Decades passed like seasons. The furniture grew brittle. The photographs on the wall faded. Dinah's hair turned gray, her back bent from years at the stove. But her eyes stayed sharp, her mind sharper still. She was the housekeeper, the nurse, the watcher in the dark. When the master aged, she became his only constant. There were no children, no family, just the two of them, and the silence that had long ago taken the place of conversation. There were days when Dinah thought she pitied him, this man who lived surrounded by echoes and ghosts of his own making. But pity has a strange way of turning, sour when mixed with memory. Sometimes she caught herself imagining the river again, the shovel, the quiet ripple of water closing over what shouldn't have been buried. Sometimes she felt her mother's voice in her head, whispering words from an older world. And though she pushed them away, they kept coming back, quiet and persistent, like the hum of insects in summer. When the new mistress arrived, everything changed. But before that chapter began, before the sickness, before the supper, there was the long, slow decay of years, 30 of them. 30 years of serving the same table, washing the same plates, waiting for a man who would never thank, her and a world that would never see her. The house was her cage and her companion. It creaked when she walked, breathed when she prayed, and held her secrets like a grave holds bones. By the time she reached her 50th year, Dinah was more ghost than woman. The other servants came and went, but she remained, and in the quiet, hours before dawn, as she stirred her pots and watched the fire flicker, she sometimes spoke softly to the empty room, not to the Lord, and not to herself, but to someone long gone, someone buried by the river. She'd whisper promises she never made good on, and warnings that only the walls could hear. The air would grow heavy in those moments, as if the house itself were listening. To the townsfolk, Dinah was just an old servant too stubborn to leave. But inside that fading house, she was something more. She was the last witness, the last keeper of what really happened. And though she never said a word, the truth lived in her, like a seed buried deep in dark soil, waiting for the right season to break open. And in the stillness of the Wainwright kitchen, beneath the rhythm of knives and spoons and boiling pots, something inside Dinah was already changing. Something that had slept for 30 years had begun to stir. When Clara first arrived at the Wainwright estate, the house seemed to pause, as if even its old bones were uncertain about welcoming someone new. The day was gray and heavy with the smell of rain, and the carriage wheels sank deep into the mud as it rolled up the drive. Dinah stood at the kitchen door, wiping her hands on her apron, watching through the curtain of drizzle as the horses stopped. The new mistress stepped down, young, pale, and too delicate for the swampy air that clung to everything in that part of Alabama. Her dress was of a northern cut, fine and fashionable, and her parasol looked like it had never been near real. Dirt Clara Wainwright was not like the women the house had known before. She spoke with a soft northern accent, each word measured and proper, as though she were afraid of being misunderstood. Her hands were gloved even when there was no reason to wear them, and her eyes, bright, almost curious, took in the house, with the kind of pity one reserves for something broken. Dinah had seen that look before, on missionaries and doctors who came south, thinking they could heal the ruins left by war. None of them stayed long. The master met Clara on the steps, his figure dark and stiff against the pale sky. He didn't reach for her, didn't smile, just nodded as she took his arm. They moved into the house together, her heels clicking lightly on the wooden steps, and Dinah felt the air shift. It wasn't joy or renewal that entered with her. It was something quieter, colder, a rearranging of ghosts. In the first weeks, Clara did what new brides always did. She decorated. She opened windows that hadn't been touched in years, letting light and dust spill into rooms that had grown used to shadow. She replaced the faded drapes, filled the parlor with flowers, and brought music into the house again. For a moment, it almost felt alive. Even the other servants walked a little straighter, caught between curiosity and relief. But Dinah kept her distance. She knew that the house, like a living thing, didn't take kindly to sudden brightness. Clara noticed Dinah early on. She was curious about the older woman who seemed to move through the house like smoke, wordless and steady. One afternoon, she followed the smell of baking bread into the kitchen, where Dinah stood over the stove, stirring a pot of thick stew. The heat of the room pressed against Clara's skin, and she hesitated at the door. Dinah didn't turn, but she said softly, "You hungry, ma'am?" The simplicity of the question startled Clara. "No, thank you," she said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to meet the woman everyone says keeps this house standing." Dinah looked up then, her eyes dark and unreadable. "This house don't need me, ma'am. It stand 'cause it don't know how to fall." Clara smiled politely, unsure how to respond. She was used to servants who bowed and nodded, not ones who spoke in riddles. She tried again, lighter this time. "Well, I hope you'll let me learn from you. I want to make this place feel like home." Dinah didn't smile back. "Ain't many homes built on graves, ma'am," she murmured. The young woman blinked, caught off guard, but before she could ask what Dinah meant, the older woman had turned back to her pot. The fire crackled between them, its glow bending across the walls. Clara left the kitchen soon after, unsettled but unable to say why. In the months that followed, the house began to swallow Clara's laughter the way it had once swallowed Anne's. The light she had brought started to dim. She found the halls drafty, the nights long. Her husband spent more and more time away, on the fields, in town, anywhere but near her. When he was home, he spoke little, and when he did, his words were clipped, final. There was something in him that chilled her, a restraint that felt dangerous, like a river just before it floods. Dinah watched this quietly. She saw the same patterns repeating, the same tension she had witnessed 30 years earlier when the first mistress began to fade, the same hushed arguments behind closed doors, the same cold silences that hung after supper. But there was one difference. Clara was not a woman bred for silence. Late one evening, when the lamps burned low and the master had retired to his study, Clara entered the kitchen again. Dinah was cleaning the knives, her movements slow and deliberate. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. "Dinah," Clara began, hesitating near the door, "do you ever feel this house watching you?" Dinah didn't look up. "A house don't watch, ma'am. It remembers." Clara stepped closer. "Then what does it remember?" The knife paused mid-wipe. Dinah glanced at her, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then she said, "It remember who it feed and who it bury." Clara shivered. The words sounded like a warning, though Dinah's voice was calm. "I think something's wrong here," Clara whispered. "Sometimes I hear footsteps at night, in the hall outside my room, and sometimes I think I see someone standing by the river when I look out the window." Dinah's face didn't change, but her eyes softened. "Don't go near that river, ma'am." Clara waited for an explanation, but none came. The older woman turned back to her work, and the conversation died there. But that night, Clara dreamed of the river. She dreamed of a woman standing in the shallows, her dress soaked and her hands dark with mud. When she woke, her pillow was wet with sweat and her throat ached from screaming. Days turned into weeks, and the strain between husband and wife deepened. Clara grew thin, restless. She stopped reading in the parlor and began to keep to her room. The servants whispered that the mistress was seeing things, that she'd begun to talk to herself. Dinah said nothing. She kept cooking, cleaning, and watching. But inside, something old was stirring again, the same dread she had felt when the first wife had begun to vanish from life piece by piece. The master's patience wore thin. Clara's questions about his past irritated him, and one night her voice carried through the house, sharp as breaking glass. She accused him of hiding something, of lying about what had come before. He shouted her into silence. Dinah, listening from the kitchen, closed her eyes. She knew that sound. The last. Words of defiance before obedience turned to tragedy. After that night, Clara tried to make peace. She brought flowers into the dining room, left notes on her husband's desk, and invited him to walk with her by the river. He refused. His distance was total, his politeness colder than anger, and Dinah could feel the weight of inevitability, pressing down again, as it had 30 years ago. But Clara was not Anne. She had the stubbornness of a woman raised to believe in her own rightness, and the loneliness of one who had realized too late that she'd married a stranger. She began spending more time with Dinah, asking questions that grew bolder. "What really happened to the first Mrs. Wainwright?" she asked one morning while Dinah kneaded dough. Dinah didn't look up. "Best not to stir old bones, ma'am, but—" "People in town, they talk," Clara pressed. "They say she disappeared, that no one saw her again after a summer storm." Dinah's hands kept moving, slow and sure. "People talk when they scared. Sometimes they talk the truth." Clara's breath caught. "So it's true then." Dinah wiped her hands and turned, her face unreadable. "You best eat your breakfast, ma'am." It was the last real conversation they had before Clara's sickness began. She fell ill in late autumn, her body weakening day by day. The doctor came and went, shaking his head, unable to name the cause. The master said little. He told Dinah to keep her comfortable, to make broth and tea, to keep her quiet. And Dinah obeyed, though each time she stirred the pot, she felt the house leaning closer, listening. The new mistress had arrived with light and laughter, but the house had taken both from her, the same way it took from everyone who lived too, close to its secrets. And as the winter crept in, the walls of the Wainwright estate began to hum again with the same old tune, one of silence, sorrow, and something waiting to be remembered. The bond between Dinah and Thomas Wainwright was something neither of them ever spoke of. Yet it lingered in every room, heavy as dust on the windowsills. It wasn't love, nor was it loyalty in its purest sense. It was something stranger, an entanglement born of history, fear, and a kind of mutual dependence that both sustained and suffocated them. For 3 decades their lives had run in parallel lines that never truly crossed, but never parted either. She knew his rhythms better than he knew himself, and he trusted her in ways that should have made him uneasy. In a world where power defined every breath, Dinah's quiet presence was the one constant in his decaying kingdom. To outsiders, it looked simple. The old servant, still dutiful after 30 years. The master, cold but predictable. Yet beneath that still surface, there was a current that never stopped moving. Dinah's silence had power in it, though no one but Wainwright seemed to feel it. He could walk into the kitchen, and without her speaking, he would pause mid-step, as though the air had thickened around him. Sometimes she would glance at him briefly, her eyes calm, her face unreadable, and he would look away first. It wasn't that she frightened him, at least not at first. It was that she remembered too much, and he knew it. After his first wife's disappearance, Dinah had become indispensable. Wainwright didn't ask her to stay, she simply did, and in some quiet, guilty corner of himself, he was grateful for it. She managed the house, prepared his meals, and ensured that no rumors left the estate's boundaries. She was the keeper of both the kitchen and his sins. He knew she had seen more than she ever admitted, that she had watched him bury something by the river under the moonlight all those years ago. He knew she had not spoken, not even when the sheriff came asking. That silence was the foundation upon which his fragile peace was built. But silence, like time, begins to rot if left too long unspoken. There were nights when Thomas would sit, alone in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand, the smell of smoke curling through the air, and he would hear the faint hum of Dinah's voice from the kitchen below. It was never a song he recognized, never words he could make out, just a low, rhythmic murmur that rose and fell like a tide. It unnerved him because it felt familiar, as if it carried something from a past he couldn't fully remember. Sometimes, he would rise from his chair and walk to the top of the stairs, listening to her voice drift up through the house. He would imagine her standing at the stove, her face lit by firelight, whispering to the air as though it answered her. He never confronted her about it. He didn't dare. In those moments, he realized he needed her far more than she needed him. The estate had long lost its prosperity, the fields overgrown, the servants dwindling one by one. Dinah remained because she chose to. Without her, the house would have collapsed in both structure and spirit. She cooked his meals, washed his clothes, tended to his ailments as he aged. When his hands began to shake, she poured his whiskey. When his legs weakened, she fetched his cane. He came to rely on her presence as he did his heartbeat, though it was a dependence he would never confess aloud. For Dinah, the bond was its own kind of prison. She had spent her youth serving a man who had taken everything from her and called it duty. Even after the war, after freedom was declared, he found ways to keep her tethered, first with the promise of wages, then with debts, then with something less tangible, obligation. Every time she thought of leaving, the river came back to her mind. The image of that night, the sound of shovels biting into wet earth, the reflection of lantern light on the water, held her in place. She told herself she stayed to survive, but the truth was more complicated. She stayed because he had made her a part of his secret, and secrets have a way of binding souls together tighter than chains ever could. There were brief moments when the master showed something that looked like kindness, a blanket left by her, dar during a winter storm, a new kettle when the old one cracked. Once, when fever had nearly taken her, he sat by her bed for hours, silent, watching her breathe. When she awoke, he left without a word, and neither spoke of it again. But those small gestures didn't erase what she knew. If anything, they made it worse. Guilt, she understood, can make a man generous in strange ways. As years turned into decades, the boundaries between them blurred. The servants who came and went spoke of it in whispers. She the only one he listened to, they'd say. Ain't no one crosser in that house. They weren't wrong. If Dinah said a guest shouldn't enter a certain room, they didn't. If she said the master wasn't to be disturbed, they obeyed. It was as though the house itself answered to her, and Wainwright allowed it. Yet neither of them acknowledged this unspoken power. Their relationship existed in the space between fear and familiarity, between confession and denial. Sometimes, when she served him supper, she'd catch him staring at her as though trying to recall who she really was. He would open his mouth as if to speak, then stop, his expression tightening into that same mask he'd worn for years. She wondered if he saw her as a woman, or just as the last remnant of his former life, the only witness he couldn't erase. The arrival of Clara disturbed that balance. Wainwright had remarried not out of love, but out of necessity. He needed an heir, a companion, perhaps even a shield from the loneliness that had begun to press down on him like a coffin lid. Dinah understood this long before Clara did. She could see how the master looked at his new wife with both desire and resentment, how he seemed to be reminded of something he had lost, or destroyed, years before. And though Dinah kept her expression neutral, she felt something stir within her. A cold, distant awareness that the past was circling back, demanding to be acknowledged. One evening, she found him sitting alone on the back porch, the bottle beside him nearly empty. The night air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and decay. "You ever think on the old days?" she asked quietly, surprising even herself. He didn't look at her. "Old days are dead, Dinah." She tilted her head slightly. "Dead don't always mean gone." He glanced at her then, eyes narrowing. "You'd do well not to bring up ghosts." "Ghosts don't need bringing up," she said. "They walk on their own." For a long time, neither spoke. The cicadas sang in the dark, and the river beyond the trees whispered its slow, eternal song. She turned to go, but before she stepped inside, he said softly, "You ain't ever told anyone, have you?" Dinah froze. The words hung in the humid air like smoke. "No, suh," she said finally, her voice even. "Ain't nothing worth telling." He nodded once, the tension in his shoulders easing, but the faintest trace of fear flickered across his face. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged what they both knew, and in that moment, Dinah understood that he no longer saw her as a servant. He saw her as the one person who could unmake him. From that night on, his demeanor toward her changed. He grew cautious, deferential even. He no longer raised his voice when she moved too slowly, no longer gave orders with the same edge. It was as if he sensed that something was shifting beneath the quiet surface of their coexistence. The balance of power, so long tilted in his favor, had begun to lean the other way. In the dim light of her kitchen, Dinah would sometimes smile to herself, though not out of triumph. It was something sadder, older, a weary recognition that their fates were bound together like two roots from the same dying tree. He had given her 30 years of servitude, but in return she had become the keeper of his guilt, the last reflection of a sin too large for either of them to name. And she knew, deep down, that when that bond finally broke, it would not break quietly. The nights in the Harwood estate began to stretch long and thin, filled with the sound of whispers that had no mouths. The house had begun to breathe on its own, creaking at odd hours, doors shifting slightly ajar, the wind pressing faintly against the window panes like a soul begging for entry. Dinah felt the change before anyone else did. She had spent decades learning to read this house the way one reads a face, and now that face seemed to grimace in discomfort. Something had broken the unspoken balance that kept the place still. The mistress had taken ill. At first it was only fatigue, a faint flush in her cheeks, and then the kind of cough that lingered long after the night candles were snuffed. Dinah tended to her like she had to so many others, with hands that moved as if memory itself guided them. She brought her broths, teas steeped in herbs she grew behind the smokehouse, and wiped the sweat from her brow with cloth dipped in cool, well water. The master thanked her each morning and night, briefly, distantly, but Dinah could feel his eyes watching longer than before. What no one in the house saw was that beneath the care, beneath the whispered prayers and sleepless nights, Dinah was studying the mistress, the fragility of her breathing, the glassy surface of her eyes as fever crept in, the way her jewelry remained heavy on her thin wrists even as she wasted away. There was something sacred and terrible about tending to the slow decay of a human being, something that made Dinah's heart ache and pulse in a way that almost frightened her. She had been taught obedience, silence, and precision, but the longer she nursed the mistress, the more she felt something older stirring inside her, something born from all the quiet pain she had swallowed for 30 years. The household doctor visited less and less. He would leave little glass bottles that Dinah was told to measure carefully. She did, but not always in the same way. Sometimes she would mix them with the herbs she trusted more than his bitter Western medicine. Sometimes she would pour a little, less, or a little more. Each night when the master sat beside his wife's bed, Dinah would stand at the door, watching the way his hand hovered above hers without ever really touching it. That space between them was like a chasm, and Dinah felt herself falling into it. The master began to change, too. His temper grew short, his sleep restless. Servants whispered that he wandered the halls at night, muttering to himself, haunted by dreams of running water and red-soaked hands. Dinah didn't need to hear the whispers to know this. She had heard him herself, pacing just beyond the kitchen door. Once he had called out a name, not his wife's, not Dinah's, but something else, something she could not understand, a name that made her skin crawl. By the third week of the mistress's illness, the air in the house had grown heavy with unease. Food spoiled faster. Candles sputtered and died before their wax was halfway gone. The other servants crossed themselves when they passed the mistress's door. Dinah alone went in and out freely. She would hum soft hymns, songs her mother had once sung by the river long ago, and those songs seemed to calm the mistress more than any medicine could. But sometimes late in the night, Dinah would feel the mistress's fingers grip hers tightly, her eyes wild and fearful, and she would whisper things, nonsense at first, and then words that chilled Dinah's blood. "He promised me eternity," the mistress once murmured, her voice trembling. "He said death would never come for us. He said we'd dine together even after the world forgot our names." Dinah had thought it the fever talking. But that night, when she brought fresh linen to the master's chamber, she saw him sitting by the fire, staring into nothing. On the table beside him sat a book, a small black leather-bound volume that she had never seen before. The pages looked older than the house itself, the edges rough and uneven. When she set the linens down, she could feel something in the air shift, as if the book itself was watching her. The master looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "She's getting worse," he said quietly. "And you're the only one she trusts now. You've always been loyal, haven't you, Dinah?" She nodded, but something in his tone made her heart slow. The way he said loyal wasn't gratitude, it was possession. "I need you to stay by her side tonight," he said. "Whatever happens, don't leave her." And then, as she turned to leave, he added, "When it's done, bring her to me." She froze. "Bring her to you." "Sir?" He smiled faintly, his lips cracked from drink or worry, or both. "You'll know what I mean when the time comes." Dinah didn't sleep that night. She sat by the mistress's bedside, listening to her breaths grow shallow and uneven. Around midnight the candles flickered, and the wind outside began to howl like something alive. The mistress stirred, her lips moving silently. Dinah leaned closer, hearing the faintest whisper, "He wants my heart." And then the room went cold. Dinah reached for the blanket, but before she could cover her, the mistress's eyes snapped open, wide, glassy, terrified. Her hand clawed at her chest, as if something inside was trying to get out. Dinah called her name, tried to hold her still, but then there was a sound, a soft, wet crack, and the mistress went still. For a moment, Dinah thought she had imagined it, but when she looked down, her hands were red. The house went silent. Not even the wind dared move. Dinah sat there for what felt like hours, her body trembling, the taste of iron thick in the air. When she finally stood, she remembered the master's words, "Bring her to me," and for reasons she couldn't explain, she obeyed. She wrapped the mistress's body carefully, carried her through the darkened halls, and descended the back stairs that led to the old kitchen. The fire there was still burning low, a pot set out as if waiting. The master was already there, the black book open beside him, a knife glinting in his hand. He didn't look at Dinah as she entered. "Set her down," he said softly. Dinah did. The rest was a blur, a haze of motion, shadow, and ritual. She heard the master speak in a language that made her bones ache. She saw the way he cut, slow and deliberate, not with the violence of a killer, but with the reverence of a priest. When he was done, he placed something into the pot. The sound it made was soft, almost tender. Then he turned to Dinah, his eyes hollow. "Tomorrow night," he whispered, "you will serve me supper." And for the first time in 30 years, Dinah felt true fear. The next day dawned gray and still, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over the Harwood estate. The house seemed quieter than it had ever been, the kind of silence that feels watchful, deliberate. Dinah moved through the morning in a daze, her apron still damp from the water she'd used to scrub the kitchen floors, though no amount of scrubbing could erase what had seeped into the cracks of the stone the night before. The master had not spoken to her since the ritual. He had gone to his study at dawn, carrying the black book and locking the door behind him. The mistress's absence went unspoken. Servants asked questions in whispers. "Is she resting? Will the doctor come again?" But no one dared approach the master directly. The air in the house told them all they needed to know. Something sacred had been defiled, though no one could name what. Dinah busied herself in the kitchen, kneading bread, peeling onions, chopping herbs that now smelled strangely sweet, almost metallic. Her hands shook whenever she touched the butcher's knife, the reflection in its blade, showing a face she hardly recognized. By evening, the master emerged. His hair was uncombed, his shirt stained, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Yet there was something different about him, an energy, almost a brightness beneath the ruin. He moved with purpose. He called for no one but Dinah. "You remember what I said last night?" he asked as he entered the kitchen. Dinah nodded slowly, her throat dry. "Then do as you were told." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. The pot sat waiting on the stove, the same one that had simmered with something unspeakable only hours ago. Its lid was in place, steam coiling lazily from the edges. She felt her stomach tighten as she lifted it, the scent that rose up thick and iron-rich, blending with spices she had added on command, rosemary, thyme, and cloves, as though masking sin with sweetness. The master sat at the head of the long oak table, his silver utensils gleaming in the dim candlelight. The empty chair beside him, where the mistress once sat for every meal, remained untouched. He gestured for Dinah to serve. Her hands moved mechanically, ladling the thick, dark stew into his bowl. The sound of it pouring was heavy and slow. When she placed it before him, he didn't thank her. He merely picked up his spoon, inhaled deeply, and began to eat. Each bite seemed to drain the color from his face, yet he continued, as though compelled by something far stronger than hunger. Dinah stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the flicker of the candlelight reflected in his eyes. The smell filled the room, rich, almost intoxicating, and for the first time she felt something stir inside her. A question, a horror she couldn't yet name. Finally, the master set his spoon down. "She's with me now," he said softly, almost lovingly. "Do you understand, Dinah? She'll never leave me." Dinah's voice trembled. "What did you do, sir?" He looked up then, and the faintest smile crept across his lips. "What you helped me do." Something inside her broke. She wanted to scream, to run, to confess. But where would she go? Who would believe her? For 30 years she had served him faithfully, obeyed every command, borne every cruelty in silence. And now, even her silence had made her an accomplice. That night, she lay awake in her small room above the pantry, listening to the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. But they were not heavy, measured steps of a man. They were softer, almost dragging, as though bare feet brushed against the floorboards. She pulled the blanket to her chin and closed her eyes, praying it was her imagination. But then came the faint creak of the master's chamber door opening, and a voice, low and whispering, that did not belong to the living. She rose before dawn, her body trembling as she descended the back staircase. The kitchen smelled faintly of smoke and decay. The pot from the night before sat cold on the hearth, untouched since supper. Only then did she notice, its lid slightly ajar, as though something had been taken from it in the night. When she went to fetch water from the well, she saw something floating in the trough beside it. A ribbon, silk, the same deep crimson the mistress favored. It was stained darker now, the fabric stiff. Dinah's breath caught and she turned toward the house. In one of the upper windows, she thought she saw a figure, thin, pale, with long hair falling loosely over her shoulders, watching her. The days that followed blurred into each other. The master grew gaunt, his appetite insatiable. He demanded the same meal each night, and each night Dinah prepared it, her hands trembling as she stirred. But she began to notice changes. The house grew colder, the mirrors fogged without reason, and the master's eyes, once gray, seemed to darken, taking on a shadowed hue that made her look away when he spoke. He muttered now as he ate, sometimes laughing softly to himself, sometimes whispering the mistress's name between bites. One evening, as she served him, Dinah caught sight of his reflection in the dining room mirror, and froze. The chair was full. 2 figures sat at the table. The master, and beside him, the outline of a woman with her head bowed, her hand resting lightly on his. But when Dinah turned around, the second chair was empty. Her knees nearly gave out. She excused herself, stumbling into the kitchen. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to flee, to abandon the house entirely. But her body betrayed her, driven by the same obedience that had defined her life. That night, when she finally gathered the courage to approach his door, she heard him speaking softly again, no longer muttering to himself, but conversing, tenderly, as if with someone present. "Do you forgive me now?" he whispered. Then came the faintest reply, fragile and distant, like a breath caught in a dream. "Not yet." The next morning, Dinah found him at the table again, the pot still steaming though she hadn't lit the fire. His eyes were open but glassy, his lips stained dark. In front of him the bowl was half empty. But what chilled her most was what sat beside it. A heart-shaped locket, one she had seen countless times resting against the mistress's throat. It was open, the portrait inside torn out. She reached for it, and a sound escaped the master's mouth, a low, strangled sigh. His chest rose once and then fell still. Dinah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, staring at the man she had served for 3 decades, now as lifeless as the woman he had claimed would never leave him. But in that silence, she realized something terrible. The house wasn't free. It was watching her. Now, waiting. She turned slowly toward the hearth. The black book lay open beside the pot, its pages fluttering, though no wind stirred. And scrawled across the newest page, in a hand not quite human, were the words, "The meal must be served again." The days after the master's death passed in a strange, suffocating haze. The Harwood estate, once filled with the hum of servants and the rhythm of routine, seemed to withdraw into itself, like a living thing in mourning, or in hiding. The authorities came and went quickly, their questions brief, their expressions uneasy. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, though none dared question why the mirrors in his chamber were covered, or why the house reeked faintly of iron and smoke. Dinah said little. Her hands remained folded, her eyes steady, her words calm. 30 years of silence had taught her how to speak without revealing a thing. Once they left, the house grew quieter than ever before. The staff began to leave one by one. The maids took their pay and fled to neighboring towns. The gardener refused to step foot near the kitchen garden, claiming he'd seen someone standing there at dusk, a woman in a blood-stained gown. By the end of the month, Dinah was alone. The great Harwood estate, with its creaking floors and locked rooms, was hers to tend. At first, she tried to continue as before. She swept the halls, dusted the furniture, lit the lamps at dusk. But something about the light had changed. Shadows lingered too long in corners. The mirrors fogged without breath. The air, once heavy with dust and the scent of oak, now carried the faint sweetness of decay. She began to hear it again. The sound of soft footsteps moving across the floors above her, the gentle creak of the rocking chair in the master's study, the faint clink of silver in the dining hall. Every night the house prepared itself for supper. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Dinah found herself drawn back to the kitchen. The black pot was still there on the hearth, though she could not remember leaving it. She should have thrown it out, buried it deep in the earth, burned it if she could, but something about it held her still. The metal looked different now, darker, almost alive. She ran a trembling hand over its rim and felt a pulse beneath her palm, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. She stumbled back, her breath sharp, her chest aching. And yet, some part of her, some deep, terrible instinct, whispered, "You must serve again." That night, she dreamed of the mistress. She stood at the foot of the bed, her skin pale as ash, her eyes clouded over like storm glass. In her hands, she carried the locket, open, the portrait within replaced by something else, something raw and red that pulsed faintly in the candlelight. "He promised me eternity," she whispered, "but you gave it to him." Then she smiled, her lips cracking as she did, and placed the locket in Dinah's hands. "Now you owe me." When Dinah woke, the locket was real. It lay on her nightstand, still open, its chain cold as river stone. From that morning onward, Dinah stopped sleeping. She moved through the house like a ghost herself, feeding the fire though she didn't recall lighting it, boiling water though. She didn't recall why. The book still sat on the dining table, open to the same page as before. Each time she passed it, the ink seemed darker, the letters more pronounced. The meal must be served again. One night, she could no longer resist. She gathered what ingredients she had left: onions, herbs, carrots, a small cut of meat from the cellar, and began to cook. The smell rose through the house, rich and warm, carrying memories of nights long gone. She moved with the same precision. She had for decades, her hands steady, her body knowing every motion by heart. But when she looked into the pot, she saw something impossible. The reflection of two faces, her own, and behind her, the mistress's. The candle beside her flickered and went out. A voice came from behind, soft, familiar. He said you were faithful, Dinah. Were you faithful to me too? Dinah froze. The air turned cold, her breath visible in the darkness. Slowly she turned around. The mistress stood there, her gown torn, her hair unbound, her eyes shining like wet glass. She wasn't whole. Her form seemed to waver, as if made of mist and memory, but her presence filled the room, suffocating and sharp. Dinah dropped to her knees. I didn't mean... You did everything he asked, the mistress interrupted. You obeyed. You served. You gave him what he wanted. But what about me? Tears spilled down Dinah's cheeks. I served you too. I cared for you when he didn't. I tried to. The mistress stepped closer. The scent of decay was unbearable now, clinging to the air like mold. You tried to save yourself, she whispered, and now you'll serve me as you served him. Dinah wanted to scream, to run, to wake from the nightmare, but her body wouldn't move. The mistress leaned forward, her cold fingers brushing Dinah's cheek, leaving behind a faint streak of red. The meal must be served again. The next morning, the fire burned bright in the hearth. Dinah stood at the table, the pot bubbling, before her. She didn't remember starting it. Her hands worked without command, chopping, stirring, seasoning. The smell that filled the room was not food. It was something older, heavier, a blend of sweetness and rot. Somewhere deep inside, Dinah realized that the house was no longer waiting for her to act. It was using her, moving through her. The Mao. Air pulsed with life not its own. By nightfall, the table was set. 2 places, silver polished, candles lit, wine poured. Dinah stood by, her body trembling. Then came the footsteps, the slow, rhythmic creak of wood under unseen weight. The dining room door opened on its own, and the mistress entered. She took her seat at the head of the table, her translucent hand resting on the rim of the bowl. Sit, she said. Dinah obeyed. Her hands shook as she lifted her spoon. The mistress smiled faintly. You've always been loyal, Dinah. That's why you'll dine with me forever. The first taste was bitter, metallic. Her body recoiled, but she couldn't stop. Each spoonful burned on its way down, yet she kept eating, her vision dimming, her heartbeat slowing. Across from her, the mistress's form grew more solid, more human, her cheeks flushing with life as Dinah's color drained away. When the candles finally guttered out, the house exhaled. Weeks later, when a traveler passing through the county stopped at the estate seeking shelter, he found the doors unlocked, the kitchen still warm, and 2 bowls set upon the table. The meal within was untouched, save for the faint impression of spoons resting in their depths. And though no one was there, the traveler swore he heard the sound of soft footsteps in the hall above, and a woman's voice whispering, almost tenderly, "Supper's ready." The Harwood estate stood empty now, or so the county records claimed. Yet those who passed by on moonless nights said the lights still flickered faintly in the upper windows, as if someone moved through the house carrying a single candle. The iron gates had rusted, the gardens overgrown with thorn and ivy, and the front steps were cracked with age. But sometimes, if you stopped long enough, you could hear it, the faint clink of cutlery, the soft hum of a woman's voice drifting. Through the trees, years passed, and the story of the Harwoods became legend. Children whispered of a servant who'd fed her master his own sin, of a house where the dead still dined. Local clergy refused to bless the grounds, claiming there were things within that had been fed too well to ever sleep. The Black Book was never found. But the people who'd once worked there, the few who dared to speak, said that Dinah's room remained untouched, her bed neatly made, her apron folded on the chair. On her nightstand sat a single locket, still open, its portrait long gone, the inside lined with a faint red stain that no one could scrub away. In 1897, a historian named William Rowe took interest in the property. He'd heard the tales from an aging priest in town, stories of ritual and madness, of the wife's mysterious illness and the servant's disappearance. Rowe was not a man who believed in ghosts. He was a rationalist, a collector of facts and fragments, convinced that even the darkest legends hid a core of truth. He gained permission from the county to survey the estate and spent his first night there in the master's old study. He recorded his impressions meticulously. "The air in the house," he wrote, "is heavy with what I can only describe as anticipation. Though the rooms are cold, there is the sense of something listening." He noted the unusual chill in the dining hall, the unlit candles still fixed in their holders, and the pot that remained blackened on the hearth. He touched it once, foolishly, as he later described, and felt an odd vibration through the metal, like the faint hum of a clock's heart. His second night was worse. He dreamed of a woman humming an old hymn in a language he couldn't place. When he woke, he found the locket from Dinah's room resting beside his bed. He was certain he hadn't brought it there. The next morning he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his chamber, slow and deliberate, though the dust on the floor showed no sign of disturbance. On the third night, he decided to test what he'd begun to suspect. He lit the fire in the kitchen hearth and set the pot upon it, just as he'd read in the old records of slave households, rituals of offering, feeding the unseen to keep the peace. He added nothing but water and a few herbs from the overgrown garden. For an hour, he waited, feeling foolish, until the smell began to change. It was faint at first, then stronger. Rosemary and cloves, yes, but beneath it something else. Iron. Decay. The scent of old blood. Rowe backed away from the fire, heart pounding. Then came a sound from behind him. A voice, soft, female. "You shouldn't have lit the fire." He turned, but no one was there, only the faint impression of footprints in the ash that had settled across the floor. Rowe fled that night, leaving his belongings behind. But he returned a week later, compelled by the same madness that had drawn so many before him. His final entry, found years later in his satchel near the estate gates, was brief. The meal must be served again. After that, no one entered. The Harwood house willingly. Its reputation grew with each decade. By the turn of the century, it had become a site of fascination for the morbidly curious, spiritualists, thrill-seekers, and those who fed on tragedy. A few claimed to see lights within. Others said they smelled cooking when the house had no fire. But none stayed longer than a night. In 1910, the county ordered the estate condemned. Workers came with axes and torches, determined to tear it down. But when they reached the dining hall, the air grew so thick and foul that they could hardly breathe. One man swore he saw two figures seated at the table, one in the pale dress of an old mistress, the other in a servant's apron, both looking up as if expecting guests. The workers fled, leaving their tools behind. That night, lightning struck the house, setting the upper floors ablaze. The fire burned for 2 days. When it finally died, only the stone foundation and the kitchen hearth remained standing. Decades later, when archaeologists excavated the ruins, they uncovered the remnants of the pot, cracked and rusted but still faintly pulsing with warmth. Inside it were traces of something that baffled experts, a residue that was neither ash nor soil, composed of iron, carbon, and calcium in impossible proportion. Human. But the strangest find lay a few feet away. 2 sets of footprints, preserved in the soot. One large, one small, facing each other. Over time, the land was reclaimed by forest. The Harwood name faded from memory, the story reduced to a regional ghost tale told by travelers and old farmers. But those who live nearby still say that the soil there will not grow anything, not grass, not wildflowers, not even weeds. The earth itself rejects the living. And sometimes, when the wind is right, the faint sound of a woman humming can be heard through the trees, followed by the soft scrape of a spoon against a bowl. Locals built a small chapel near the edge of the property in the 1950s, hoping to cleanse what remained. The priest who oversaw the dedication refused to enter the ruins. He said he could feel something waiting inside, something old and hungry. A month after the chapel opened, he vanished. When they searched his quarters, they found a single note on his desk. I heard her call my name. Today, the Harwood site is fenced off, its location omitted from official maps. Yet every few years, someone finds it anyway. A group of hikers once stumbled upon the foundation at dusk. They said they found a single iron pot sitting among the stones, filled with stagnant water, though there was no sign of rain for weeks. One of them, a woman, claimed she saw her own reflection in the water, but smiling back at her was not her face. Those who believe in curses say the ritual never ended, that when the master died, the hunger he and Dinah awoke passed into the land itself. It demands repetition, obedience. It waits for hands willing to serve, and those who don't believe, those who laugh at the story, who visit the ruins and scoff at the old legends, they often return home with small scratches across their wrists or faint bruises on their throats, shaped like fingers pressing gently, almost lovingly. It is said that the Harwood estate is quiet most nights, the kind of silence that feels ancient and watchful. But every few decades, when the moon wanes and the air turns heavy, that silence breaks. Somewhere deep beneath the overgrown stone and ash, a faint metallic sound begins, the stirring of an old pot, the bubbling of water that has not known rest, and then from the darkness comes a voice. Soft, patient, familiar. Supper's ready. If you've made it this far, you already know this wasn't just a story. It was a glimpse into the shadows of history that most people never dare to look at. Stories like Dinah's aren't written in clean ink or preserved in gold. They're whispered through time, soaked in pain, loyalty, betrayal, and blood. They remind us that behind every polished portrait of the past lies a truth no one wanted to face, one that shaped the world we live in today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, raw, unfiltered, and honest, then this is your moment to join the journey. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because what's coming next will take you even deeper into the forgotten corners of human history, where the lines between devotion and madness, servitude and revenge are never clear. I want to hear what you think. Was Dinah a victim of circumstance, or the author of her own dark justice? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective matters here. Let's talk about the untold motives, the buried truths, and the quiet power of those history tried to erase. Your engagement keeps these forgotten voices alive. Subscribe, comment, and share this story if it moved you. Because history isn't over. It's still whispering through every story we dare to remember.